100 Winters, Retracing the Great Race Against Death, written by Jonathan Nathaniel Hayes, illustrated by Caleb Gingra. Chapter 1, The Centennial Serum Expedition. It was the perfect storm. An outbreak of diphtheria in the remote subarctic coastal village of Nome, Alaska in 1925. Curtis Welch, the only doctor for hundreds of miles, had placed an order for serum the year before, but it never arrived. The few vials that Nome had on hand were all expired. The village needed antitoxin, fast. But there were no roads across the vast expanse of wilderness. Deliverance could not come by horse or automobile. The ocean, frozen for the winter, stretched for hundreds of miles. Ships could not reach them. Not only was Nome battling record-low temperatures, but the blizzard of the century was approaching. The primitive airplanes in Fairbanks couldn't take off, much less travel through such conditions. Deliverance could not come by air. As the death toll rose, the sense of urgency grew. Unlike pandemics that claim the elderly, diphtheria is known as the strangler of children. Without antitoxin, parents were forced to watch helplessly as their children slowly suffocated. Once contracted, even a healthy toddler could be dead within days. The only way to deliver the life-saving serum across what President Reagan later called the cruelest miles was by dog team. And if Nome had to trust its fate to a musher, it would be Leonard Seppala, a Norwegian immigrant turned Nome resident. Over the past decade preceding the outbreak, Seppala had earned a reputation as the most famous and successful dog driver in Alaska. His dogs, imported from Siberia, were an extension of himself. Both he and his dogs were small but rugged, piercing blue eyes. At first, people underestimated Seppala and his Siberian rats. But those who bet against them learned quickly that you couldn't judge this dog-eared book, a diminutive man and his dogs, by its rugged cover. By the time of the diphtheria outbreak, Seppala and his lead dog, Togo, were household names throughout Alaska. So a plan was put in motion. The serum would depart from the train station in Nenana, Alaska, nearly 700 miles inland, with musher Wild Bill Shannon. The original plan had Shannon mushing the serum all the way to Nulato. Seppala's mission was to mush from Nome to Nulato and back with the serum, a grueling 600-mile round trip all by himself. Seppala set off down Nome's front street with 20 dogs in a harness. His strategy was to drop off dogs at roadhouses along the way, then swap out tired dogs for fresh ones on the return trip to maintain speed. However, after Seppala's departure, the pressure of the pandemic caused the governor to change the plan. It was decided that the entire route, including Seppala's portion, would become a relay. Out on the trail, Seppala was far from the telegraph lines, and there was no way to notify him of the change. So Sepp, as he was known, pressed on, crossing out onto the ocean ice to save days in this great race against death. Ultimately, the 675-mile route was traveled by a relay of 20 mushers, 17 of whom were Alaska natives, and 150 dogs. Mushers battled against wind chills as low as minus 85 degrees Fahrenheit, whiteouts, open water, high winds, exhaustion, and darkness. Several heroic dogs sacrificed themselves to save the lives of Nome's children in the relay, which newspapers would later dub the Great Race of Mercy. But none traveled farther or risked more than Seppala. his leader, Togo, and his team of dogs that would later come to be known as Seppala Siberians. Together, they braved the sea ice of Norton Sound twice and traveled a brutal 261 miles in unfathomable conditions. This book chronicles the Centennial Seppala expedition, in which I mushed a single dog team the entire route from Nenana to Nome during the same cold, dark days of winter. Along the way, this book explores the stories of the original 20 mushers who undertook this heroic task 100 years before me. Months leading up to the expedition, I was warned by some Yukon natives and Alaskan mushers that this undertaking couldn't be done at this time of year. Several villagers along the route explained, "We don't even travel between villages this early in winter. The rivers are too unpredictable. The temperatures are too cold. There's too little daylight. We wait until the second week of February to start putting in trails." It became clear to me that if we were going to stick to the historical start date of January 27th, we would have to break our own trail for most of the route. And we could only do that if Alaska provided the snow and ice conditions we needed. But Alaska had other plans. Just days before the start, regional mushing legend Aaron Burmeister told me the weather and snow conditions this season were unprecedented and unpredictable. While conditions had been good a couple weeks earlier, a massive amount of rain and snow had flooded the waterways. In northern and interior Alaska, the rivers are the highways. Without good ice, there's no travel except by airplane, even a century after the original Serum run. Just south of our starting point in Nenana, we were blocked by an avalanche for an entire night. It was then that the social media critics began to voice their overt disapproval. It was as though they never truly expected us to show up in Alaska at all, much less start in these harsh conditions. To many, completing this expedition at this time of year was an impossibility, but there we were, preparing to give it a go. 2 Alaska distance dog sled races have been canceled for this weekend. As a musher who runs dogs in this region, it is reckless for Mainers to consider doing this expedition until conditions improve, one said. Ironically, these same naysayers would later try to downplay our success once it became clear that we were on track to finish. What's the big deal? The Iditarod mushers do this every year. There have been reenactments over the past 30 years. Why is this one any different? I will therefore lay out here at the outset several reasons this expedition is significant and distinct from other efforts, not to diminish the rigor of those endeavors, but to impress upon the reader the weight of what we were undertaking. The magic of winter travel by dog team is that it allows you to explore the wilderness that's never been traveled before. This is true in every season, but none more so than during the coldest and darkest days of winter, when even the animals that call this unforgiving land home do not stir for days at a time. No human has crossed the virgin snow or the river's ice. The landscape is as foreign to mankind as if you were stepping onto an alien planet. This is why it's inaccurate to compare this expedition to undertakings in later months of the year. There have been reenactments of the Serum run in the past, and while it's true that this region is tough to traverse at any time of year, those reenactments were conducted 1 or 2 months later than the original Serum run, and for good reason. In March, there are several more hours of daylight, and it's on average 15 degrees warmer. Those reenactments followed the Iditarod and Iron Dog trails, which are already packed and marked. In contrast, We had to labor, men and dogs, tooth and nail through every hard-won mile. We slogged through 4 feet of fresh snow, 2 feet of overflow on the rivers, open water, darkness, the same temperatures that plagued the original run a century before. Many of these same comparisons apply to the Iditarod sled dog race. The race is run more than a month after the January expedition for similar reasons: more light, warmer conditions, better trails. The Iditarod racers follow a trail that's been packed by 13 to 18 wide-tracked snow machines, and every 45 miles or so, they have a checkpoint with resupplies, warm meals, and veterinarians for the dogs. Now, this is not to say that our expedition was more difficult than the Iditarod. It's an apples to oranges comparison. Iditarod racers must contend with sleep deprivation and time constraints, which we didn't face. My dogs had more recovery time each day. We were also making a film that honored the original mushers, including interviews with their families. We spent entire days visiting native village schools, speaking at churches along the way. This all took time. Leaving aside comparisons to races and reenactments, I'll now address the comparison to the original Serum run. A reporter from Alaska's news source asked me if running this expedition made me appreciate the original mushers more, given they didn't have the modern technology to assist them. Yes, I replied. My respect for them has grown immensely through this expedition, but not for the reasons you might think. In many respects, it would have been easier back then than it is now. For instance, 100 years ago, the 20 mushers in the relay only ran trails they knew well, with the exception of Seppala, who traveled far beyond his home range. These trails were the same ones they used for mail supplies and social calls. The original mushers traveled them multiple times a week, so their lead dogs knew them intimately, even in extreme weather. In contrast, my leaders, Druid and Vodka, had no such home court advantage. To them, there were no known trails, and in many areas, no trails at all. Another advantage of the original mushers was the network of roadhouses, located every 30 to 50 miles, much like the checkpoints of a distance dog sled race. Those roadhouses provided travelers with warm meals and beds, as well as game meat for the dogs. They were, in effect, the gas stations of their day, fueling both mushers and dogs. In comparison, our expedition faced the daunting challenge of covering long stretches without such support. Snow machines would be our attempt to make up for that disparity. So I added the skilled and rugged Mainers, Jamie Nichols and Jeff Kelly, to the team. Their snow machines were, in essence, our rolling roadhouses. We lost valuable time as the snow machines bravely battled the elements to break out a trail while hauling heavy loads in conditions that locals avoided. Looking back, there's no doubt that arriving at roadhouses by dog team every night would have been far easier than Jeff and Jamie's efforts hauling thousands of pounds of weight through unbroken terrain over hundreds of miles. Also, the mushers in the relay could push their dogs on familiar trails harder, knowing they only had that one leg. My goal was to see every dog in my team finish in Nome, happy and healthy. Even the clothing of the original mushers was, in many ways, superior to what we have today. Technology makes great gear affordable, but nothing compares to ancient native clothing technologies, garments of caribou, polar bear, and seal. Such garments, while superior in many respects, are all but unattainable to a modern explorer. In fact, I will say that many of the items that served us best on the expedition were those primitive native garments we were able to procure along the way. That said, there was one major advantage I had over the original dog drivers of the Serum run a century ago. When faced with life or death conditions twice during this expedition, I knew I could tap out and hunker down. In other words, if the situation became too overwhelming, I had the option to call for help, press an SOS button on a GPS, and rescue would eventually come. In stark contrast, the original mushers who set out in the blizzard of the century had no such safety net. If they couldn't rescue themselves, they would die. They risked their lives, not for their own survival, but to save the children of Nome in a way that we, in our own commemoration of their bravery, did not. Why did they take such a perilous risk? Because they valued life, even the lives of children they had never met. As I pondered the reporter's question about my increased respect for these original mushers, this thought took hold of me, and I was overcome with emotion. I thought of their extraordinary bravery, their unwavering love for their fellow man, and the deep respect they had for life, not just their own, but the lives of others. They were true heroes, worth commemorating. And that is why I had come all this way with my dogs, to honor the trail they broke, the lives they saved, and the courage it took to run this great race against death. Subscribe to this podcast right now so that you don't miss Chapter 2, the journey of 12,000 miles of this new book, 100 Winters. I look forward to sharing that with you next time.